Hello and welcome back to Bendigo SDA Live. And today I'm joined by James Bowen from Biblical Hope channel. Is that on YouTube, James?
Yeah, I stream YouTube, and I also do a Facebook page where I upload like original documents and just live full text links for folks to go take a look at the information and sources themselves.
So it's you're a bit of a historian.
The thing is, I'm a layperson, and
Sure,
I don't have any kind of doctoral degree to that.
sure.
But I have a feeling, or maybe I guess a strong belief that we as lay people should be educated, and it shouldn't just be like the scholars in our church. So my goal
Yeah,
is to empower the ordinary layperson to understand and to see where things are going.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So,
Yeah, that's right. I'm certainly not a scholar myself, but I'm interested in history, and I think that
yeah,
anyone can look into it. And
for
I'm
sure.
hoping to learn something from you today about maybe the trumpets
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Revelation. I think guessed that right, and maybe even something to do with Islam as well and
yeah,
its destiny.
yeah.
Um, so first, let me just pray for you, and then I'll
Mhm,
I'll just let you share with me. How's that?
Sure, sounds great.
Okay, let's pray. Our Father in heaven, I pray that as we talk about history and learn about the Bible and the different uh, ways that it's been understood over the years, Lord, I pray that you be with James, that you would help him to be able to explain what it is that he's discovered in a way that's clear, and I pray that you would help us to receive what you want us to hear. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So,
Okay.
yeah, my interest in the trumpets stemmed, I think, primarily from a long-standing interest of mine in, uh, of course, what Adventism believes, what our position is in terms of a historicist one, and we take the position that all of these trumpets, opposed to the rest of the Protestant world, they think they're all in the future. We see these as
Right.
occurring throughout history, just like the seven seals
Yeah.
of Revelation. Um, so as a kid
So,
growing up,
so James,
mhm,
where can we find these trumpets? What's the Bible reference there? I'll
Revelation
put it in the
chapter 9,
notes.
yeah.
Okay.
So the particular trumpets that we're talking about today is the fifth and the sixth trumpets. And I'll briefly go over, 1 through 4. Classic Uriah Smith is, trumpet 1 is the attack of the Visigoths against Rome under Alaric. Second is attack of the Vandals against Rome. The third would be the attack of the Huns against Rome. The fourth is the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The fifth, which is what we're talking about today, would be the rise of Islam, thought to be in 1299. And then the sixth would be the Ottoman Empire, from the reign for 391 years and 15 days, which ended
Okay.
in August 11th, 1840. And then the seventh trumpet would be like when the mystery of God is finished, like when everything is done for this world.
Yeah.
And
And that's in a later chapter. Um,
yes,
yes.
yeah.
So, James, do you want to just fill us in? You mentioned Uriah Smith. Who's Uriah Smith?
Yeah, so Uriah Smith is a very prominent historicist writer within the Adventist Church who was alive around the time of Ellen White, who wrote a book called Daniel and Revelation. And it was one of the books that Ellen White recommended that we read and study. Now,
And
I
sell,
wouldn't,
wasn't it?
yes,
Sell
yes,
or distribute to
yeah,
non-Seventh Day
absolutely.
Adventists. Yeah.
And it's not a book too that's necessarily we hold up as inspired, like on the same
Sure.
level as Ellen White. In fact, one of the things that we can point out that maybe where he might have made a mistake would be Daniel chapter 11, where he takes the position of switching the King of the North to being Turkey, and Ellen
Uh-huh.
White in the Great Controversy holds to the King of the North as always being like the papacy, and then
Sure.
she supports a position, perhaps as some people have pointed out, the King of the South being like secularism or atheism.
Mm.
And so he wasn't perfect, but
Sure.
Ellen White seemed to correct him in the things that he got wrong and let him stand where he got a lot right.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so,
So this is a book that we're not saying it's inspired. We're not saying that
mhm,
it's infallible, but
right.
it's been a book that's had a lot of respect in our
Yeah.
tradition of our church.
Mhm.
And so this is certainly where you know a lot of Adventists in the past would have understood
Yeah.
this to be correct. Now, what changed? Um, I
Well,
know that I've been to many seminars and
yeah.
Revelation seminars, evangelistic. sermons, and I've never encountered in any of those. I have heard of it, but not from any of those. This idea that Islam might have something to do with Bible prophecy. What
Yeah,
happened?
yeah. So it is still taught in some circles within Adventism today, but shortly
Sure.
after Ellen White died, there was a Bible conference in 1919 where the archives were actually said to have been, they were supposed to have been locked up in a vault. The members who attended really wanted the events that transpired within that conference to be kept kind of under wraps, because there were some things said that were perhaps a little edgy, a little problematic, and so I would say probably the shift where people started to question and doubt the classic historicist position on the fifth and sixth trumpets probably started primarily at that conference all the way back in 1919, only a couple of years after Ellen White died. And
Yeah.
so over the years, it's been something that we haven't emphasized as much. And for me, for anybody watching today, the reason why I think this is so important, like, how does this connect back to our salvation? And the reason why I would say that is the understanding of the time periods within the fifth and sixth trumpets by Josiah Litch, and subsequently, as was mentioned in Great Controversy 334, Ellen White mentioned Josiah Litch by name and his beliefs. It affected William Miller and brought about his understanding of the day for a year principle. So when Josiah Litch's idea that a couple years in the future, in his day, the Ottoman Empire would fall, that brought about the idea that, hey, we're onto something here with the day for a year principle. And it
Yeah.
helped Miller arrive at 1844 for the end of the 2300 days. So this is critical. It's one of those critical early milestones, early lessons that we learned that brought about our entire existence as a
Okay.
church.
Do you want to just well, maybe I'll do this. I've heard this story before, and it's quite
Mhm.
a amazing story. So back in the 1800s,
Mhm.
there was one of our early preachers that predicted the fall of the Ottoman Empire,
Mhm.
and everyone thought that it didn't happen. But then they got the news, because the news took a little while to come
Yeah.
from Europe,
Mhm.
that the Ottoman Empire had ceded their sovereignty to the United Kingdom, or
Mhm.
something like that. Does that
Yeah.
sound about right?
Yeah.
So
So
this, even at the time, this was like, wow, this is amazing. This way of studying prophecy must be true. So
mhm.
now what we're saying is that this prediction that kind of cemented our way of understanding prophecy has now been put aside
Yeah.
by our church. We no longer
Mhm.
accept this root, this foundation.
Yeah.
Um, so how could that possibly, like, what is the evidence? Why do we not use that
Well,
anymore?
it started with W. Prescott at the 1919 Bible Conference, and he was a Dartmouth-educated theologian within Adventism. Uh,
Dartmouth being,
Dartmouth being a non-Adventist higher education. Of course, it's one of the Ivy League schools, well known
okay.
now.
So Ivy
And
League, for the non-Americans, means
yeah,
top university.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, but not an Adventist school. And
yeah.
he started to question the reliability um, of the dates and time periods for the Turks and Ottoman Empire based on
Okay,
reading a German theologian by the name of von Hammer.
okay.
And so von Hammer or Joseph von Hammer was a prominent 19th century German historicist or historian who looked at the historical time periods and specifically when the Ottoman and Turkish empires began and arose to power.
So
And
is this with one M or two M's?
von Hammer, it's two M's. Yeah,
Okay,
von Hammer.
just
Yeah,
wanted to get that right before I put it up on the screen.
Sure, Joseph von Hammer. And
Yeah,
so he was looking at von Hammer's works and he's saying, hey, he's saying that um, the Turks, when they initially attacked and started their raiding campaigns under their first king, King Othman, that
okay.
began in the year 1301 or 1302, but it
So
did
this
not.
is just after the Crusades, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah,
he's
okay,
saying it did not begin what Josiah Litch said, which was 1299.
okay.
And
Seems like a pretty small difference.
It
Um,
does, but it makes big differences. It makes a big difference when you're looking at the greater time period, which is 391 days and 15 years, or
yeah.
391 years and 15 days.
So it's a
So
small difference at the beginning, but it makes a big difference because the prediction would have
absolutely.
been invalid if
Yeah,
that
exactly.
other date was the correct one. Okay.
Yeah. And so, how was the original date 1299 established by Josiah Litch? Well, he looked at Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And Edward Gibbons was a prominent, one of the most authoritative sources on
Yep.
Roman history and history under the nations that succeeded Rome since. And so um, Edward Gibbons had written that the initial attack by Othman I, against the castle Baphium
Mhm.
began in the year 1299, specifically July 27th, 1299. And
Now, Gibbon, by the way, just
mhm,
in case anyone hasn't heard of this guy, he wrote the book called Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire,
mhm,
where he actually blamed Christianity for the fall of the Roman Empire. So
mm,
this is not a Christian apologist or anything
yeah,
like that. This is a very secular person.
yeah,
That doesn't necessarily mean that he's perfect, once again, or
mhm,
that he doesn't
yeah,
make mistakes. But
yep,
what you're saying is that Josiah Litch, this early Adventist fellow,
mhm,
he actually got his understanding of the beginning date from this secular historian, who was the
mhm,
only historian really,
yeah.
maybe, that was available to him at the time.
And Edward Gibbons was often, he's been called by some the unwitting observer to the apocalypse, because
Mm,
he writes about a lot of the events that transpire in the apocalypse without any literal understanding or biblical understanding of how this fulfilled Bible prophecy. But a lot
mm,
of his work, unwittingly, and perhaps in some ways he might have known. He did reference the images of gold, silver, and bronze in
yeah,
their successive order were
you must have
broken
heard of
by,
that somehow.
yeah, monarchy
Yeah,
of Rome. So he might have had an
yeah,
inkling, but not very much.
yeah. I
Um,
don't agree with him about calling it a monarchy. I would call it
yeah,
a dictatorship. But
yeah,
it's the
yeah.
same thing to the casual observer, isn't it? That
Well,
I think America and Rome are basically the same system. The president is like well, not a dictator, but like a monarch of sorts, but without the title.
well,
And Rome,
Uriah Smith, though, when he talked about the Roman Empire, the seven heads, five are fallen, one is, he referenced Osiander's work, which actually did identify the first head of Roman power as kings. And then it was
sure,
kings, consuls, decemvirs, triumvirs, imperial power, and so exarch of Ravenna, and so on. So
okay.
there might have been some kings along there somewhere, uh,
Yeah, there
but
were some, but that was
obviously,
before Rome was powerful.
yeah,
So
yeah, sure, sure.
yeah,
Yeah, so if you can open up the screen share there, I've got
sure.
a little bit about Edward Gibbons right here. This is Edward Gibbons' book, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This particular volume is volume 3, available on archive.org. Here we have page 608 in the reader of 828. And we'll zoom this in right here. And it says here it was on July 27th, AD 1299, that Othman first invaded the territory of Nicomedia. And so this was the date here that's in question, and it's not actually the actual date itself, July 27th, that's in question by scholars today, but it's the year. And so that gives us a little bit of leeway, a little bit of room to discuss that. And I've got some evidence that I think suggests that and supports it. But again, this is an 18th century work from Edward Gibbons, and he wasn't the only one that thought it. We have a 17th century work by Posini, who also thought the same thing, and I've got that pulled up right here. This was the Corpus Scriptorum Historiae Byzantinae. This was
Okay,
published in 1835, but originally written by Posini in the 17th century.
okay.
And
So we're talking here about histories that were written more or less, well,
yeah,
not at the time, but some time ago, that
yeah,
are probably based more on accounts and things like that,
mhm,
rather than archaeology or something. So at the end of the day, how do we really decide when to declare the beginning of an empire? It seems a little bit, it would be very difficult to really
mhm,
say exactly when an empire began. Are there any other
mhm.
dates that we can use as reference points in this prophecy. Should we look at the prophecy itself?
Yeah, we should. Actually, verse 11
Okay,
is
so
that
Revelation
9 verse
chapter
11.
9, verse 11.
This was thought to be the identifier for when this period started, and this was the particular clue right here within the chiastic structure of the chapter that um, people like Uriah Smith and Josiah Litch thought when this time period would begin would be. It says they had a king over them, the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon and Greek is Apollyon, that is destroyer. So within the description of
Interesting.
the entire chapter, it's thought to begin when they have this king, when they have their first king. And so that was the identifier there. And of course,
So
go
first
ahead.
king, I mean, there's more to it though, that isn't there? That he comes from. Now, in traditional KJV style Bibles, it would say like mine, bottomless pit, and of course that sounds a bit like something from a computer game or something. But that word in the Greek simply means a completely empty space.
Yeah.
Right. So you could say maybe the desert,
Yeah, exactly.
or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of fits maybe an Arab, maybe, and his name is Destroyer. What do you make of that?
Well, I think in this case it's referencing, of course, the style, the type of empire that these people would had. There's more to it there that I think could be gleaned from the particular name, but Othman was thought, of course, in a Muslim empire that followed, to be the destroyers based on how they operated and what they did to the nations they came up against.
Yeah.
You might have heard something more there yourself
No,
from.
I haven't necessarily. I've just been often curious because
Yeah.
it emphasizes it so much that it says it in Hebrew and in Greek, and yet it's never been clear to me what the significance of that is. So yeah, okay, all right. So what about this starting date? So where do we get the dates from, or should we look first at the characteristics?
Yeah,
What?
I think the characteristics are important and interesting here as well. One of the things that we have here, we have clues. The locusts look like horses prepared for battle in verse 7.
Okay, verse 7.
Yeah, they wore crowns of gold. Their faces resembled human faces. Their hair was like women's hair. Their teeth were like lions' teeth. They had breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings were the thundering of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. They had
Okay.
tails with stingers like scorpions, and their tails, they had power to torment for 5 months. So it gets especially interesting for me in the later verses, and I want to highlight
Yeah.
something real fast here. We have
Okay. Before you do that, let me just comment on what you just read. That locusts would be creatures that come from the desert, wouldn't they? Come
absolutely.
from the east, come, and they move very fast, and they ascend and they destroy, they consume everything, and prepared for battle. Would also match this idea of a mighty army, a mighty empire. So I guess what we can see clearly is that this prophecy is talking about some kind of a mighty empire. Maybe we can even say that being a locust, it is a political entity, because that is a beast, and locust is a beast. But a locust is a very small beast, so it's not necessarily the same kind of political entity as those other ones that we know from Bible prophecy, lions and bears and goats and rams and all this kind of thing, which are very unified. Maybe this is a more ununified empire, but nevertheless they work together. Locusts are often in Scripture described as not having an ultimate king necessarily, but they work together. Now, obviously, we know that there is a king in this case because it mentions him. But I like to think about, what does the imagery tell us about the characteristics of this empire? So far at the moment, I'm thinking maybe one of the Islamic empires, which is, I know where you're going, or maybe the Mongols, something like that. They would also kind of fit this same kind of description. No, Mongols not so well in the sense that they don't come from the desert, or maybe it's just Islam generally. So let's try to narrow it down. What else have we got? You were going to say something.
Yeah, so one of the things I found interesting was how this army would attack. So with the Arab horse, it was very fleet of foot, and they would come in and they would attack and then run away before they could be fully met on a
Yeah,
regular battlefield. So it was
a
almost
bit
like
like a locust.
yeah, exactly. It's like this
Yeah,
annoying
yeah,
insect that you can't actually
yeah.
ever face head on.
That's
But
right.
so the colors here, fiery red, dark blue, yellow as sulfur.
Hmm.
And specifically, I love the clue about smoke and sulfur came out of their mouths.
Uh,
And
yeah.
so I
So which
like
verse
that.
is that in?
Yeah, that would be verse 17 and
So now we're going to the next trumpet. Okay.
yes.
Before we go to
Yes.
the next trumpet, let me just point out in verse 10,
Mhm,
um, they had tails like scorpions, and there were sitting in their tail stings in their tail. Sorry, their
mhm,
power was to hurt men 5 months. Now,
mhm,
of course, a tail in Bible prophecy represents a false prophet, right?
mhm.
So if their power is in their false prophet, once again, this gives us a clue that it's to do with Islam rather than Mongols or something like that, or Attila the Hun or someone like that. But what does this say? 5 months. It was given to them to hurt men 5 months. What would that be talking about?
Yeah, so if we use a day for year principle, a month would be 30 days. Multiply that times 5, you get 150 days. But if we use the principle from Ezekiel 4:6 and Numbers 14, verse 34, you're going to get a day for a year. Because as Ezekiel 4:6, God told Ezekiel, I've appointed thee a day for a year. And you're right about the false prophet being a reference to the tail piece, because Isaiah 9, verse 15 said that a prophet who teaches falsehood is the tail. So that's very, I think,
Isaiah 9:15, wasn't it?
yes, that's exactly where I was coming from.
Yeah. So let me just add that this day for year principle is not simply something that is. You're right that it's explicitly mentioned in those two passages,
Hmm.
but there are many other passages that support this principle. This isn't just something that we've selectively chosen
Hmm.
to use. Every time there's apocalyptic prophecy,
Hmm.
this is always consistently used. And when you understand it using this day for year principle, you get some amazing revelations, like, for example, an exact prediction about Jesus coming and his
Yes.
crucifixion and his ascension into heaven and all of the rest of
Hmm.
it. So and the founding of the church, I should say. So this day for year principle is not simply some arcane rumor. There's real significant Bible prophecy that uses this and uses it to point to Jesus.
Hmm.
So I think that's very important for people to realize that when we talk about this day for year principle, we're not just being pedantic or something. This is
Hmm.
actually important,
Yeah.
because if we reject the day for year principle, we're taking away from prophecies about Jesus as well.
Mhm. And we weren't actually the first ones to use the day for year principle for the 2300 days either. Actually, the monk of Bamberg, or thought to be the monk of Bamberg in about the 12th or 13th century, when these events were occurring, actually published a Disseminae Scriptorum, where it's actually published under, I think, Vatican Library 3819, where we see an idea of the 2300 days being thought to be 2300 years, but it didn't catch on at that time within Catholicism. But this
Sure.
idea of the principle of day for years was very ancient, well beyond
Yeah.
these gentlemen here.
Well, that's right. There's nothing new under the sun, is there?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So we haven't yet seen what the 5 months represent. Are you wanting to say that now, or do you want to talk
Um,
more about the next trumpet first, just so that we've got a stronger basis for?
yeah, I think let's
Okay.
jump to the next trumpet first, and we'll come back and take a
So this
closer look.
is 13 to 21 of chapter 9.
Yeah. So it said to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the, verse 14, release the four angels that are bound at the great river Euphrates. The four angels have been kept ready for this very hour and day and month and year. So here we see that same time period being an hour, which would be translated to prophetic time would be 15 days, a day, which would be a year, a month, which would be 30 years, and then a year, which would be 360 years. So you add 360 plus 30 plus 1 plus 15 days. So 391 years and 15 days, if we're
Mm,
using that principle. And
sure. Yeah. I've always found that a very interesting application of this principle, because you talk about day for year, but now we're talking about an hour.
yeah.
How many days or how many years, like divide the 360 by 24. but then if that's not what it means, what does it mean? Is it simply a vague, an hour and a day and a month and a year, like, some vague thing, or is it actually meaningful? And I think it comes down to, if you can find a meaningful interpretation for it, why would you
Sure.
ignore that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So verse 16, the number of mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000. I heard their number.
So
And
200 million.
yeah, it's quite a lot. Um, the horses and riders I saw in my vision looked like this. So here we have this description of what they look like.
Mm.
The breastplates were fiery red, dark blue, and yellow as sulfur. The heads of the horses resembled the heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and sulfur. A third of mankind was killed by 3 plagues of fire, smoke, and sulfur that came out of their mouths. And the power of horses was in their mouths and their tails, for their tails were like snakes, having heads with which they inflict injury. So I just want to pause here for a moment, and maybe read an ancient historian who had some insight
Sure.
into this. So I'm going to read a little bit from Charles Daubez. Charles Daubez was a vicar of Brotherton. He was a member of the Church of England, a clergyman and a theologian from 1673 to 1717. That
So
was when he lived.
how do you spell his surname?
Charles, and then
Yep.
Daubuz.
Okay. So if anyone's trying to find that,
Yeah.
there it is.
And so he lived from 1673 to 1717. He wrote a perpetual commentary on the Revelation of St. John in 1720. I have a copy of that right here. And he has this interesting thing to say about the Ottomans right here. He says, the horsemen had breastplates of fire and of hyacinth and of brimstone. The color of brimstone is yellow, and that of fire red, that of hyacinth blue. For it is the color of the air or smoky clouds. In this there may be an allusion to the brightness of their armor, which when shone upon the sun would reflect these colors, or the colors of their warlike apparel may be here hinted at, the Ottomans from their first appearance having affected to be clothed in scarlet, blue, and yellow, leaving the green color to the kinsmen of Muhammad. So this was 200 or at least 100 years before the time of Josiah Litch. We have somebody who's a member of the Church of England who looked at the Ottomans and realized, hey, these guys have these colors from Revelation.
Okay. So there's some matching colors. Where do is that the color of their military uniform that they had, or
Yeah.
what? Okay.
Yeah, they did, and even their horses would have a gold like helmet over their horse to protect their horse. I had a picture of one in one of my videos, but yeah, this would have been exactly what they look like. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right, let's say, all right, well, we accept then that that the Turkish Ottoman Empire is the sixth trumpet, and maybe something to do with the fifth as well. Is there any more that you wanted to bring to bear on that, or should we go to the dates?
One of the things I wanted to point out is the smoke and sulfur that came out of their mouths.
Yes.
The Ottomans were thought to be some of the earliest inventors of the bombard cannon and gunpowder. And so if you think...
I'll tell you a story about that before you go on. There was a Christian that invented the cannon, as I understand it, and he approached the Byzantine king or emperor and said, I've made this invention. Would you buy it off me? And he said, oh no, we don't need that. And then he approached another, maybe it was a Catholic kingdom, and said, well, would you buy this off me? And they said, oh no, we don't need that. And then finally, he went to the Ottomans and said, well, would you buy it off me? And they said, oh yes, we will. And so I think it was actually a Christian that invented it. Now that story may have been garbled. I've heard it told, but I haven't actually seen a historical assessment on it. But it's quite possible that it was actually invented. There's some truth in it that the cannon was invented by a Christian. but it was used anyway, like you say, first by the Ottomans. And of course, I'm going to say the cannon. We're talking about massive,
Absolutely.
massive big cannons.
Yeah. And so, imagine seeing this kind of stuff going on from the eyes of John. How would
Mm,
he describe it in his language? Well, it's like smoke and sulfur. Well, sulfur is one of the ingredients for gunpowder. So,
true.
this sulfur, saltpeter, and
Yeah.
whatever else they had in it. But
Sure. Yeah. Black powder. Yeah.
yeah, that's going to be one of your components there. So,
Yeah.
and then the one thing I'll say about these two trumpets is the very next events in the next chapter, just to kind of frame where all of this would be occurring in history, talks about the bitter scroll and the events that followed that. And of course, not to get too far off course into that topic, but
Sure.
Adventists, we look at the events of Revelation 10 as following directly after these two trumpets here. And we have this idea of perhaps a disappointment with John eating this scroll. It's sweet in the mouth, bitter in the stomach. And then he has to prophesy again before many peoples, nations, and languages. Um, so there's perhaps some ideas within the next chapter about a message regarding the coming of Christ that is bitter to
Yeah.
John. And it
Yeah.
follows this. So it fits sequentially
Yeah.
in terms of what we're talking about here.
That's right. And I would just add to that I've looked recently through the book of Revelation and noticed where there are markers of a break because the book, it's often called the book of Revelations because there's actually multiple revelations within it. We call it Revelation because we want to emphasize its unity as a book. But for example, there's a marker at the beginning of chapter 7, and then the same one in verse 9. After these things, I looked, right? And so then from there, it goes on, and you don't see one of those markers all the way until the end of chapter 17, right? So all of that section is part of one unified vision. The beginning of chapter 12 does have a kind of a half break where it says, now a great sign appeared in heaven. But nevertheless, the point that you're making is that you should take, within this vision, you should take the events chronologically. You shouldn't simply say, well, this could be happening at any time. It's like, well, no, the chapters were added in later, and there is no actual verbal marking that would indicate that chapter 10 does not follow on from chapter 9 in the prophecies.
Yeah, so going back to the dates, this right here, I want to point out is, well, we've talked a little bit about Edward Gibbons, where he identified perhaps where this first king goes and attacks and begins the empire of the Turks for perhaps the first time period of this whole prophecy. He's referencing in his book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, this date, July 27th, 1299. Now, that date was originally referenced here in George Pachamari's Andronicus Paleologos. And this is the 25th chapter right here, where he says, the Vigésima Septima circa Baphium. And this is the year Luige right there, which is, it's Latin for July. And this would be the 27th, Vigésima de Septima circa Baphium. So Baphium was this castle. And when this attack by Othman I comes, he has to cross a flooded moat. And that's going to be one of the key indicators in this entire work that led Edward Gibbons to think that 1299 was the right year. And it wasn't just him, but of course, obviously Possini, who translated his work and was one of those 17th century scholars, and of course Edward Gibbons being 18th century, who thought as well, hey, this is 1299 that we're talking about here. The reason why confusion's arisen by some modern scholars today is, if you go back to this is the guy who's alive at this time period. This is Pachamari's, who's actually alive during the time period and lived in the day. is he has a weird way of writing. He tends to write about things that happened in the past and then things that happened in the future, all from his perspective in a manner that's a bit confusing. And it's hard to follow it sometimes. And it's been a challenge for people because he's talking about, hey, this happened in the past and this happened in the future. But the way he goes about it, it's not always very clear. Nevertheless, the date itself is clear from his work. It's July 27th. Now, what year? That's the bigger question that scholars have debated and had issue over. But there's good evidence that I think that establishes the year in the sense of the flooding in the moat, the castle moat, because 1299 had just come out of a very, very hard winter. There was a lot of ice pack. There was a lot of snow that had fallen. And so when the summer comes or when July comes, you would have that snow melt and then cause a lot of flooding. The years that followed in 1301 and 1302 were drought years. So from if you will, a meteorological standpoint, the year 1299 fits because the following years were droughts. And why would you have such massive flooding that he describes if it's a drought year? It doesn't make any sense. And so that would be one of the reasons why I would believe that Edward Gibbons and Posini, who lived 100 years before the time of von Hammer, actually had it right. And it's these later, newer theologians who aren't going back and examining the evidence and saying, hey, the Bothium was surrounded in 1299 and not 1301 or 1302.
Right. Okay. So, all right, you've given us a good reason to take the 1299 date seriously. So what do you then do with this date? Like, what prophecy does this relate to?
So this would relate to the 150 years. So if we take the 150-year period and we play it forward from 1299.
So this is Revelation 9, verse 10.
Yeah.
Okay. Revelation 9:10. 150 years from 1299. Okay. And where does that take us to?
That's going to take us to 1449. And about that time period in 1449, we have a shift in power from the Turks to the Ottoman Empire when the attack began on Constantinople and when the siege began on Constantinople. And so around that time period, about 150 years later, that's about the time that we have, it was Constantine XI, and it was the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who lays siege to Constantinople. So we have, during the time of Constantine Palaiologos, and then we have this surrounding of Constantinople in the beginning of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, that was a big time period there where you start to see those bombard cannons used in the siege around Constantinople, and you start to see gunpowder being used. That was one of the famous historical incidences where we see this kind of military power using that. And it goes
Definitely. And they made gigantic cannons for that purpose.
Absolutely.
So let me just clarify here then. So the 150-year period that you talked about, which starts at 1299, this indicates the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, but not the empire, the kingdom of the Ottoman Turks. But it's not until 1449 that you see the beginning of the empire. Is that what we're saying?
So what we're saying is that the first 150 years is actually more like it's thought to be the Turks, thought to
as
be
a kingdom.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you get the Ottoman Empire. There's a slight difference between the two. I've got a link.
Yeah, there is a slight difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. So initially the Turks were simply one of many factions fighting it out for power in the Middle Ages. But when they took Constantinople, of course, they became a force to be reckoned with. They became a very significant empire from that time onwards. And as we know, they even had a big part to play in World War One. Of course, that's later than what we're talking about. But the point is that even to this day, Turkey continues to be a very powerful and significant nation, and may even continue to be even more so into the future. So, so this is important. So this empire was simply a nation before 1449, but at 1449, at the end of the 150 years, that's when you're saying it became an empire. So is that an exact date, 1449? Is that when the siege began or ended, or was?
Going back to the exact time period there, I have found some historical sources that point to the year 1449, and I've mentioned some of those in some of my videos, but I didn't have those pulled up entirely for this. I should have, but
That's okay. So tell me again the name of your channel, and I'll put it in the comments for people to see.
Biblical Hope. Yeah.
Biblical on YouTube.
Yeah.
So people can find more information there. But okay, let's keep going.
So the question is, though, how do we date and time this prophecy as a whole? While we do have an idea, an inkling with this king as giving us an idea of when the whole time prophecy starts, there isn't really a good indicator, a good clear indicator that breaks off the 391 years and 15 days all on its own, that we can start that time period from without referencing the previous time period. Like, what I'm trying to say is the two are connected, and
sure. There's a lot of continuity as well as break. So let me give you, my perspective. I don't know much about this prophecy, but I have studied a lot into the prophecies of Daniel, chapter 8 and 9 particularly, and that's what I find, especially with the prophecies of Daniel 12, that there are real specific. There's really meaningful dates there, and they're specific, right? Yeah. But you could easily miss them. Yeah. They're not so obvious that, it's like a slap in the face. But then when you think about it, what is obvious? Like, the nature of history is that it has certain points that we can point to and say, well, this was a significant moment, but there's always going to be continuity. There's never going to be one day, it was the Roman Empire, powerful and strong. The next moment, boom, all these barbarian kingdoms vying for who gets to be the successor to the Roman Empire, or whatever, right? So there's all sorts of maybe dates within the context that people may suggest because it's not too obvious. But when you break down all the possibilities, you end up getting to just maybe one or two dates that really could be possible, and it really narrows it down.
Yeah. Of course, if we take the whole time period as a whole, we get 150 years, and then we add that plus 391 years and 15 days. Okay. That was ultimately where Litch was going with all of this, and he said, let's put. Yeah, he said, let's put these two. Go ahead. Sorry.
So I was just going to say, so where we get that in Revelation again, the hour and the day and the month, year.
Yeah, exactly. So
which verse is that again?
That would be verse
chapter 9, verse
15.
15. Okay. So Revelation, I'll just write that down. You keep talking.
Yeah. So Revelation 9, verse 15. The one thing I'll say about this whole time period, just briefly before we connect these two, is Adventists, at least back in the day, said, the fifth trumpet sounds and then the sixth trumpet sounds. There are some today who say that, that the fifth trumpet, they put it a little farther along in history than 1299. And if you put it too far along, if you put it, after the date of 1449, then you have the sixth trumpet, assuming we keep the same dates the same, sounding first, and then the fifth trumpet coming after the sixth. So it throws the chronology off.
Right. It gets distorted. Okay. So the Revelation 9:15 date then adds directly on to the back of the chapter, the 9 verse 10 date, and basically the evidence for that is the lack of discontinuity. There isn't really any indication that you should expect a gap there. And if you were to put a gap there, it would be basically completely arbitrary. You'd be making up whatever gap suited you. Okay, so I like that. So we're taking one period and then another period straight away.
We have a clue with the smoke and sulfur and perhaps the Constantinople, but
Mm,
really to make these two time periods mesh, I like to view them as having some sense of continuity, and I think Josiah
yeah,
Litch did as well.
yeah,
Now,
for sure.
so he connected them, and his connection, if we're going from July 27th, 1299, was that this whole time period, both of them connected, would end August 11th, 1840.
So, sorry, how many years are there in an hour and a day and a month and a year?
391 years and 15 days.
391 years
Mhm.
and 15 days.
Yeah.
Very precise. Okay.
Yeah. So he connected these time periods and arrived at August 11th, 1840. And
And a specific date in that year, wasn't it?
yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
August 11. Oh, sorry, you did say that, didn't you? August
Hmm.
11, 19, 18, 18 what?
1840. Yeah.
40. Okay.
And I actually found the work that he referenced, that he viewed as supportive of his hypothesis here. This was the Correspondence Relative to the Affairs of the Levant, Volume 2. It's available on Google Books. And this happened about a year after the fact. Of course, his initial prediction for this occurred about a couple years before the events of 1840. So he said, "Hey, this is going to happen yet in the future. That Ottomans are going to fall based on my hypothesis here." And this book was published in 1841 and backs up the situation as it unfolded. So if we text search it, and you can go to Google Books and text search it yourself. There's a story here about a ship called the Rifat Bay, which was the demands of the European powers, and it was sent to the Sultan. And what was happening is the Ottoman Empire was starting to fade at this time period, and they had one of their vassals, Egypt, who was an upstart, if you will, and coming and attacking and causing them problems. And so they felt their sense of weakness and appealed to the European powers for protection. And this ship, the Rifat Bay, took this ultimatum to the Alexandria, and it was ultimately accepted by the Ottoman leader, and he accepted uh, um, protection by the European powers. But the ship itself carrying this arrived August 11th, 1840. And so this was when that bell struck, when that bell rang, if you will.
Mm,
And it was seen to be not just by Josiah Litch, but many newspapers in his own writings on the matter highlight how newspapers around the day, the headlines were, "Hey, the Ottoman Empire has finally come to an end. This is their
mm,
weakness. They've accepted protection from the European powers." Now,
mm,
there were still battles fought after that time period, but that was when they started to wane as a power,
mhm.
and they were seen to be weak at that point.
So to clarify here, the prophecy isn't saying that the Ottoman Empire would cease to exist
Mm-mm.
on this date. It's that it would be powerful and a formidable
Mhm.
opponent. It would be a destructive power
Mhm.
until that point.
Yeah.
And so once you get to that point, this is when you would expect that it would become muted now. And
Mhm.
so you get to World War One, where the Ottoman Empire was essentially, you know, just fighting as a part of a European coalition.
Yeah.
It was basically taking orders from Germany.
Mhm.
So that is a very different kind of Ottoman Empire. Still a great nation, still a great kingdom or whatever, but
Mhm.
not not the scourge of Europe the way that it had been before.
Yeah. And so these are all dates that, from what I've studied and read, can be established. And the reason why I think it's important today is there are some within our church today who doubt the day for a year principle. They
Mm,
doubt the idea of the sanctuary. Did we get it right with 2,300 days being 2,300 years? We didn't see
sure.
anything in heaven above on 1844. Was our whole idea of calculation in prophetic time correct. Now, to back
Yeah.
up a moment there, of course, we did see the stars fall. We did see, the great earthquake of Lisbon. We did see some indicators. We did
True.
see we did see a movement that uplifts the law of God, which was within the
Uh-huh.
the most holy place of the sanctuary, within the Ark of the Covenant. So
Mhm.
yes, we did see some things, but we didn't see Christ coming in the
Yeah.
clouds of glory at that
Right.
time. There
Which
was,
which isn't, for the record, isn't actually what the prophecy predicted, but it's
yeah,
what was expected.
yeah, that's
Which
right,
is,
that's
it's
right.
funny, isn't it? How people today who know better,
Yeah.
we know that that's not what the prophecy was predicting,
Mhm.
then still use that as an evidence that the prophecy was wrong. Well, they say, oh, it was just convenient. It's like, well, convenient or not, it's
Yeah,
clear in the scripture that's not what the prophecy was talking about.
yeah.
Also, because as I mentioned, this is one that I'm interested in. Look at what happened at the end of the earlier phase of the prophecy, the part of the phase that is specifically for the Jewish people, right? What happened at the end of that phase? Well, people say, oh, Stephen was stoned or something. It's like, well, first of all, we don't have a clear date for that, and secondly, what's the significance of that? People say, oh, because God didn't like the Jews anymore after that. It's like, since when does God hate the Jews? God doesn't hate the Jews, right? But when you look at that prophecy, you can see that it's the same kind of fulfillment at the end of the 490 years. And I know that this is not what we're talking about in this video, but it's the same sort of fulfillment as it
Mhm.
is at the end of the complete 2,300 years. So actually, it fits perfectly,
Mhm.
and it's not just some excuse that someone's made up. So yeah, Xavier principle, definitely, points to Christ. It makes our understanding of prophecy all about Jesus rather than being all
Mm.
about some weirdos back in the day that worship themselves or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's fantastic. All right, what else does it do for us?
Well, there's a couple things it does. I think, in many ways, understanding the history here is really important for us, and we're going to have people at the end of time. The very last thing that we would expect at the end of time was, and what Ellen White said would happen was that the testimonies were going to be made of no effect.
Mm,
And some people say, well, Josiah Litch later on repudiated his own theory.
right.
But if we're logically consistent, Jones and Waggoner later left the truth that Ellen White said was truth in terms of righteousness by faith. Like, they
That's right.
went and apostatized later as well. We see
Yeah.
that in the Bible, that there were sometimes legitimate prophets in the Bible even who
Yeah.
held to truth at one point and then apostatized later in their lifetime.
Mm,
Solomon himself was once very wise, but later on he became, you know, marrying all these women who and engaging in their own idolatrous standards. So I think in the sense, we shouldn't reject Lich entirely, even though he repudiated it later on, because the history backs him up, and we have access to that now that he may not have had fully later on to know the truth of where he was.
Do you
Um,
know why he might have repudiated it?
I haven't studied that in depth. I think it was
Mm,
due to the difficulty at the time of fully establishing the dates. And
mm,
this is a article that I wanted to share for all of your listeners to take a look at,
thank
by
you.
Dr. Alberto Treyer. He is a doctorate in theology, Protestant faculty of the University of Strasbourg, France. This was published in the International Journal of Humanities and Social Science. And he is, of course, an Adventist, and I think probably does some of the best job of establishing the historical record for 1299, how that date was in fact set in stone. He goes into a lot of detail in terms of some other events we haven't even mentioned, like the torch ceremony, um, the winters. We touched on that briefly, but he talks a little bit about some of the battles that took place and some of the mistakes that von Hammer and others might have made back in the 19th century. The one thing I like about this is he gives evidence as to why the position on 1299 is correct. There have been some scholars that have come since who said, hey, other scholars said so and so, but they didn't really give any good coherent reason as to why those scholars might have been correct or incorrect. He gives reasons, logical reasons, as to why the year was 1299. And so, when we come along, for example, to 1919 with
Mm,
W.W. Prescott, when we come later on to folks like, for example, Desmond Ford, 1299 for him, what he does is he says, Um, he makes some statements here from others pointing out how they looked up von Hammer and said, oh, well, von Hammer thought that there was a mistake that was made here based on these two battles. And that was it. There wasn't anything
Yeah.
deeper into the history or deeper into what actually might have been going on. It was just so and so thought something, and that was
Yeah.
truth.
Well, if he's the expert, he must be right, right? Forget about the prophets of God and inspiration and all the rest of it. No, no, no. If
Exactly.
he's the expert,
Yeah,
he must be right. It's like, well,
exactly.
if only we treated the Bible that way.
Yeah, I know, right? And the thing is that he would make statements like scholars no longer accept Gibbon's error regarding 1299, and just it wasn't really something that was much very deep. And even W.
Yeah,
Prescott himself, he says von Hammer puts it at 1301, but some people have said 1301, some people have said 1302. That alone says, hey, there's some doubt here, and this needs to be
yeah,
investigated thoroughly. So maybe
yeah,
Spirit of Prophecy is right on this.
yeah, yeah. Well, look, what I find interesting about the doubts about the date is, I think you presented good evidence that the date is correct. But even if we didn't have such good evidence, if we have the date for Constantinople and we have the date for the fall of the Ottoman Empire, sure,
Yeah.
we aren't the ones that predicted it. He predicted it. He got it right. Okay, great.
Yeah.
But we know that those dates are correct now,
Hmm.
right? Well, then the starting date must be correct as well. So
Yeah.
looking back on it, we have no reason to doubt that this fits.
Yeah.
Now, I still don't quite understand. Is it just because some random scholar said, "Oh, I don't agree"? Is that why we don't teach this anymore? I don't fully understand why we
Well,
don't. But
I think some of the reasons why we don't teach it anymore is to really. This has been a challenge for me to fully understand. I'll tell you.
uh,
I've gone
yeah,
back and read Alberto
same with Daniel
Treyer's.
12.
Yeah,
It's the same problem.
I've gone and read Alberto Treyer's book, and
Mm,
one of the things that I think really needs to happen for our church is for perhaps some of our young people, audiovisual minded people, to sit down with these scholars and say, help me put into words and graphical language that the common
mm,
layperson can understand what you're trying to say by this. And I
mm,
think that some people have looked at 1299 and these doubts brought up by men like Des Ford and W. Prescott and said, well, I don't know how I'm going to go disprove them. And they,
yeah,
they they haven't gone back to the original works and said, well, let's go read them ourselves and find out.
yeah,
And sometimes scholars like these folks of Von Hammer and others leave out salient points that if you go back and
yeah,
read the original works yourself, you're going to find it yourself, and you're going to find the
yeah.
evidence when you really search, putting your faith
That's
on the
it.
side of inspiration and God.
That's it. Jesus said, "Seek and you shall find."
Yeah,
Right? He said, "You will find me if you search for me with all your heart."
yeah,
And I think if there's one thing that we can definitely take from this about Jesus, it's that he doesn't always make things too easy for us.
mm,
Jesus wants us to be an active part of our getting to know him. He doesn't
mm,
simply want to be the one doing all the you know the getting to know. Um,
yeah,
Jesus knows us, but he wants us to get to know him,
yeah,
and our relationship with him is more than just um, saying, "Oh, I'm a Christian."
yeah,
It's also actually wanting to get to know Jesus, studying the Bible,
yeah,
questioning things, but not questioning um, Jesus himself
mm,
necessarily. I mean, we have our dark moments, but to question mere mortals who claim to know better than Jesus and say, well, is this really true? What they say,
yeah,
and that's something that I think we can take from this, and also maybe another time we might study into what does this mean for Islam and for
yeah,
wanting to try to communicate with people who are from the Islamic faith.
yeah,
There's certainly a negative element to this picture, but also there's a positive element to it as well of God having a purpose for Islam and having allowed Islam to come up for a reason. And yeah, this
one of
very
the
interesting.
one of the things that I love about this is understanding this and happening so long ago from our perspective, maybe 2, 3, 400 years ago. It gives me a lot of hope. The
Mm,
channel, my channel is Biblical Hope. The reason why it gives me hope is because if we go through the trumpets, and if the
mm,
sixth, fifth, and sixth are that that distant in the past, not overly
mm,
distant, but that distant in the past, it
mm,
gives me hope that maybe we are this close to the final trumpet, to when
yeah,
God can come back and save
yeah,
us. And maybe we are getting through the events of Revelation 10 and 11 and 12 and all of the chapters. Maybe we are this close
yeah,
to when we don't have any more pain in this world, and we don't have to deal with individuals coming and attacking, and God having to warn his people through trumpets, which were, they were the signals in battle.
yeah,
Praise God for a time when we won't have battle and we won't have to worry about a trumpet sounding an incoming
yeah,
attack.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so sound the trumpet now while it's needed.
that's right.
And yeah, let's
Absolutely.
reach the people of the world so that, yeah,
Yeah,
they'll be ready when the
for sure.
last events do happen. Yeah.
The thing I think is, I think it's so important for lay people and everybody else to understand this, because there's going to come a time where everything's going to get shaken. Our
Mm,
faith is going to get shaken, and I think if we don't understand these kinds of deep concepts within the Bible,
mm,
then we're going to be more likely to get tossed around and not know where our feet are. And
mm,
so I want to challenge every individual person to go study on their own.
yeah. Thank you. And thank you, James, for
Yeah, thank
sharing
you.
your research with us. So yeah, as was said, if you want to look at more of James's research, Biblical Hope YouTube
Yeah.
channel
Mhm.
has those resources and where to find them. If whatever it doesn't have, and I'll say a prayer for you now, James, if
Yeah,
that's all
thank
right,
you.
and
Sure.
let's, yeah, wrap it up. Father in heaven, thank you for James and his research, and thank you for the way that he's been able to explain that to us just in brief today. Lord, I pray that you would bless him and his ministry. Pray that you would help him to be able to share the truth about history and the fact that you know what is happening on earth and you're in control, and that you have raised up kings and you've set down kings in order to help people to turn to you. So for everyone who is watching, everyone who sees this video, I pray that every one of us, might turn to you, turn to Jesus for our salvation. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Hey, thank you
And
so much.
thank you, James. All right. Well, we'll have to do another one of these again sometime. But in the
Yeah.
meantime, thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.